Welcome to the Ready Room Podcast. I am your host, Josh, and today we are going to be talking about U.S. service rifles since World War I. Hope you guys really enjoy. All right, guys, for those of you who actually follow along with the podcast and you listen every week, first of all, thank you so much. We really appreciate you. Second of all, we took a week off with Memorial Day going on, just because we wanted to respect Memorial Day. I also spent the entire weekend, and I mean the entire weekend, replacing all 4 ball joints on my truck. But I really wanted to do something that would honor those who'd fallen in service to their country and fellow Americans. Due to Memorial Day. I just wanted to honor that. So I decided to do an episode on U.S. service rifles since World War I. This isn't to say that I don't want to honor, those before World War I, or that they're any less important, or that we don't respect the firearms prior to World War I. It's just that I find the firearms of the early 1900s and up much more interesting, especially since there's a drastic change in technology after World War I, or during World War I, slightly prior to World War I, and ahead. It's just there's a big change in technology there, and pre-World War I, the technology growth is a lot smaller, in my opinion. Military equipment and firearms always drastically change during times of war, when there's lessons to be learned, enemy weapons to understand. The development happens really quickly in wartime versus peacetime, where you're just doing basic R&D, and they may be trying to further things, but there's less pressure. It's just different, and you'll notice that throughout the entire, history of America, things always develop much faster during times of war. But before we get too deep in the weeds, guys, if you're listening on a podcast site, first of all, again, thank you so much for listening. We really appreciate it. If you like the show, if you listen every once in a while, if you are a regular, please leave a review. It would really help the show out. Reviews are the number one way to help out podcasts themselves. It's not like just a regular YouTube channel, and it's not like a show. A podcast really feeds off of the reviews. The reviews help bring more people in, and it helps you in the rankings as well. It helps the podcast get advertised more. It really helps out. So please leave a review if you can. If you're watching on YouTube, I also appreciate you guys. There's few of you, much fewer, but if there are some of you listening on YouTube, we really appreciate it. I'm sorry today's episode is going to be a boring image of my face versus a guest. It is just me today. Again, I'm working on some new guests coming in. I would like to get to the point where we can do guests every week, but that is a good ways down the road. But if you're listening or watching on YouTube, subscribe, hit the notification bell so you can see any new episodes coming out. And if you don't mind, sharing it would really help spread the show as well. If you share in the YouTube channel, you can share the podcast as well. But if you're listening on YouTube, sharing would help out a lot. And share it with your friends. Share it with anybody who has similar interests as you. Today is a drier episode to most. It's not flashy. It's not. There's no guest, but it's still an interesting topic to me, and hopefully it's still interesting to some of you. Before we get into specific rifles, I want to say that we're not going to be doing extremely deep dives on these rifles. I mean, we're going to go into detail, but we're not going to go into a 2-hour video on one specific firearm. Okay. If you want that kind of information, that kind of detail, then you need to go to CN Arsenal on YouTube. Check out some of their stuff. They have hundreds upon hundreds of hours of informational content. Okay. They do a really good job. They have a lot of things to show, and they do a really good job producing So go check those guys out. I have no affiliation with them. I just know that I used to look at a lot of their videos for information back in the day. And I think if you don't mind the drier informational content, then go check out CN Arsenal and get the really, really in-depth stuff, okay? So starting off with World War One, right? Because we're doing from World War One and up. Now we might go back one day, guys, and dive into the pre-World War One service rifles. But for now, we're starting off with World War One, and we're going to start off with the Springfield 1903 bolt-action rifle. Okay, and I know a lot of you know this firearm. This rifle was officially named the United States Rifle Caliber 30-06 Model 1903, which is a long mouthful that the military loves to make. They love to make things, a nice mouthful. And the 1903 was adopted as an improvement and to replace the Craggy Jorgensen. And the Crag was the first standard issue. I know I said I wasn't going to go into too much detail of things before the 1903, but just to show you what the 1903 was replacing, the Craggy Jorgensen was a standard issue repeating rifle, the very first standard issue repeating rifle that the U.S. military used. And it itself was an improvement over trapdoor rifles. But in the early 1900s, even the Crag was vastly, outdated. With Germany producing the Mauser 98, which was being exported to other countries, and there were other major countries producing their own modern, updated bolt-action rifles, America really needed to update their arsenal. So America learned this lesson in the Battle of San Juan Hill in 1898, where some Spanish fighters that were vastly outnumbered, I believe it was 750 versus thousands of American, soldiers or American Expeditionary Forces, whatever it's called. This was in 1893. Yeah, 1893. No, I'm sorry. No, my bad. Sorry, it was the Battle of San Juan Hill in 1898, but the Spanish fighters were using 1893 Mausers. That's why the 93 was stuck in my head. And they inflicted immense casualties against U.S. troops. I mean, just immense casualties in a matter of minutes. The U.S. troops were armed with their 1892-99 Craggy Jorgensens, but they were completely outclassed by the Mauser rifle. So the U.S. Army Board of Investigations recommended replacing the Crag as soon as possible because they recognized that the Crag was completely outdated compared to the Mauser, and they needed to do something about it. They needed to catch up. They needed to figure something out, right? So along comes the Springfield 1903. Now, this is skipping ahead quite a bit. I'm skipping through some of the development, right? Because I don't want this to be the driest episode ever. But the 1903 comes about, and it's extremely based on a Mauser, and specifically the Mauser 98 action. Okay, it adopted 2 locking lugs at the front of the bolt, unlike the Crag's single locking lug, as well as a safety lug in the rear of the bolt, which engages up against the receiver bridge. And for those of you who don't know what locking lugs are often square or rectangular lugs of metal that are attached or built into the bolt body itself, and they butt up against other metal built into the receiver or the receiver itself, and they're there to lock up and make sure that when the firearm fires, the bolt doesn't move rearward, the bolt doesn't disengage, it doesn't go out of battery, it doesn't they tries to reduce headspace loss over time. So 2 locking lugs was a vast improvement over the Crag's single locking lug. This allowed for increased pressure with any more modern cartridges. It's safer, as well as the safety lug in the back. A lot of people disagree. A lot of people think safety lugs are unnecessary, but the safety lug is a lug that doesn't have anything to do with locking up or headspace, but it is there as an extra lug. If there's a failure in the front 2 lugs, it's one more thing to prevent the bolt from coming rearward into the shooter. So this was very much like the Mauser. It used a large claw extractor, which is almost identical to the Mauser extractor. And if you guys have ever used any of the, I think it's the first 2 generation Winchester Model 70s use Mauser extractors. A lot of firearms use Mauser extractor, guys. It's extremely common. Most control feed bolt actions are using Mauser extractors. And control feed just means that when it picks up the next cartridge in the magazine, it gets a hold of it immediately. As soon as the cartridge comes out of the magazine, the extractor gets control of the cartridge via the rim in the back of the cartridge up against the bolt face. Push feed is the alternative, where you push the bolt forward, it pushes the cartridge up and out of the magazine, and then it eventually gets control, not really control of it. It eventually engages in the extractor once it goes into battery or in the chamber. As you lock up, it will eventually, whatever kind of extractor it's using will pop over the rim, right, and get a hold of it so that when you pull it rearward, it can extract. I prefer control feed. It's got a lot of advantages. A lot of people prefer push feed. That's solely based on preference. There's pros and cons to both. I have trouble with like push feed. If I'm shooting precision rifles, I actually don't prefer push feed, just for the fact that it sometimes doesn't, want to load it the first time. That's just my personal preference. I prefer control feed, to each their own. The 1903 also had a 24-inch barrel, which was considered very, very short at the time compared to the really long rifles. So this actually eliminated the need for both a rifle and a short carbine, or what they would call a carbine or carbine. Because the military is often, guys, if you don't know much about the pre-World War I or World War I era, having a long rifle for infantry and then a short carbine for cavalry was the thing. I mean, Russia messed around with it. Germany messed around with it. Austria. I mean, everyone messed around with a long. It was kind of the standard to have a really long infantry rifle, because they assumed longer barrel meant more accuracy. And if anyone knows much about barrel length, there is a point of diminishing returns, and eventually you get to the point in barrel length where you're actually slowing down the projectile because there's no more powder burning behind it, and all you're doing is adding friction. So it was just not an amazing understanding of ballistics yet. They were still learning ballistics, velocity, pressure curves, all this fun stuff. So they had that, and then cavalry or tankers, or which tanks were brand new in World War I, right? So this is not solely based on tankers. It's mostly based on cavalry. A carbine was used for the mobile troops, and this 1903, being 24 inches, was considered an in-between, and eliminated the need for two separate rifles. So it made logistics a little easier, production a little easier. You make one size, which was really good. And then this service rifle was chambered in the brand new cartridge 30-06, which, if you don't remember from our ammunition selection episode, or there was another episode where it actually mentioned where 30-06 got its name, but 30-06 was 30 caliber, which, diameter of the projectile in American, right? .30. And then .06 was 1906, the year it came into service. So the 1903 came in with the 30-06. I know 03 is before 06, but you guys got to understand there's testing and prototypes and all these things that change. So it might be the 1903, and then it comes into service in whatever year it was. And it might be, sometimes it's 5 or 6 years later, guys. A lot of times these things will be like, all right, we're going to designate it this year, but then it's not even taken into issue for a couple years. So it's chambered in 30-06, which is another German design, the Spitzer projectile, which is a pointed projectile designed to be more aerodynamic, because up until then, most of the ammunition was either flat nose or heavily rounded noses. And the Spitzer was just higher velocities, more aerodynamic. Just there was advantages to it, and America adapted to the Spitzer design. And most countries immediately, once they realized how good the Spitzer performed compared to the typical cartridges of the time, most countries immediately switched to Spitzer projectiles. So they have this rifle that's very heavily influenced over or by the Mauser. But you got to give us credit, I guess. We try to be crafty. They changed a few things. And some of the things I feel like were only changed to make it seem like it wasn't a Mauser. Like the two-piece firing pin system. No massive advantage, although I actually prefer the two-piece for disassembly. No insane advantage on a two-piece firing pin, but they did it. And there's other small changes in it. Sometimes it seems like they were just trying to make it seem like it wasn't a Mauser, and sometimes, other things could be things that they thought of at the time. Remember, I'm not going into super in-depth, out of the papers, out of the testing. I'm not coming out of this real deep dive. If you want that, see an Arsenal. This is just conversation about these service rifles, okay, guys? So we know that the 1903 had a few alterations from the overall Mauser design, right? But it was, in fact, for sure, a Mauser design. And so much so that Mauser filed a lawsuit and won, and the U.S. government was judged to have to pay over $500,000 in royalties, which, if you guys don't know, $500,000 back in the 1900s, early 1900s, is a lot of money. I kind of want to Google that real quick. $500,000 in, let's just say 1908. Let's see. That's like $14.5 million, guys, in 1908. That's the equivalent of $14.5 million in royalties that they had to pay. However, that gets pretty complicated when you get to the war. When you get to World War I, those royalties and that payout gets a little complicated. There was some sketchy stuff America may or may not have done to avoid paying all of it. You can look into that on your own time. I don't have enough information to give you an accurate explanation of the scenario, but I know that some shady things took place since we just happened to be over in Europe for a war. It got a little sketchy. Okay, look into that. Look into America, or Mauser's lawsuit against America. Right, look into that, and you're gonna find some interesting information. Okay. But so the early production 1903s had some heat treating issues, and this is allegedly. I've heard some pretty good information on this. I can't say for certain. I wasn't there, right? But allegedly, this is because the temperature of these receivers when they were heat treating them, it was judged by sight, right? So they would look at them and say, okay, it's at the proper temperature. And the issue with this is if it was sunny or cloudy outside, or if the lighting was different inside the manufacturing area, the visual color of the metal would be different, right? So the metal might be at the same temperature today and tomorrow in the same furnace or heat treating, whatever they're using, kiln, whatever they're using to heat treat, right? The metal might be the exact same temperature, but because it's sunny today and cloudy tomorrow, the metal might look different, right? So this actually led to some interesting issues with heat treating. It actually led to a high risk of these receivers being very brittle, which was dangerous because, if you got a good pressure around and you got a brittle receiver, you're eventually asking for an ouchies. So they did figure this out. They figured it out relatively quickly in the grand scheme of things. When you look at production service rifles, usually 500,000 is pretty quick. So if you're wondering if your 1903 is fine, the only ones that were at risk were the original 1903 models underneath the 500,000 serial number. Okay, so if you have a 1903 A3 or an A4 or a regular 1903 past the 500,000 serial number mark, you should be fine. Don't worry about it, right? And you still shouldn't shoot super high pressure 30-06, by the way. Try to shoot the lower pressure curves. But yeah, so they figured this out. They figured out they had heat treating issues, and they installed proper measuring equipment. And the issue never came back, right? So, and there were multiple manufacturers, guys. I think with the original 1903, it was Springfield Armory and, oh man, I actually forgot who. I should have written that one down. That's my bad. I forgot who actually made the original. Rock Island Arsenal. That's what it was. Rock Island Arsenal were the original producers of the 1903. They're cranking these things out, so eventually when you get to World War II and stuff, you have the 1903 A3, A4, all that stuff. You got Remington in the mix. You have Smith Corona and many other companies were making 1903s. And this is what happens in major wartime, guys. What ends up happening is a lot of companies that may have not even been building firearms will start building firearms. I mean, with the M1 carbine, for example, the 30 caliber carbine, sewing machine companies were making firearms. In fact, if you have a Singer M1 carbine, hold on to that thing. This is not financial advice, just letting you know. A little more sought after than your average, I don't know, Universal or whatever. What's the other one? I honestly forgot the two most common M1 carbines. It's been a while since I really looked into those. But Singer's not your more common, right? So many people made these things. Some people had heat treating issues, some didn't. And like I said, it was really, really low in the serial number range. They made millions of the things, guys. So then actually kind of, speaking of the 1903A3 and the A4, I think we should segue into the submodels, right? Because submodels are a thing. As development goes forward, or advancements in technology or decision making, they will keep the same rifle and make tweaks and modifications to it and alterations to it over time. It's still the same bare bones, at its bones, it's the same rifle. But let's say they change the rear sight. Okay, well, they'll usually annotate that with either a mark on some guns, heck, I want someone to try and figure out on your own, like go research the difference in all the different Lee Infield British rifles, okay? I mean, they would make one small change, and then they have to give it a new nomenclature. So you have like the number 1 Mark whatever, number 2, number 3, number 4 Mark 1, number 4 Mark 2. Like there was a number and then a mark for all these different alterations. And the reason for the British, they couldn't decide on sights. They couldn't decide on. Well, they were pretty good on stocks. They only changed the stocks a couple times, but they kept making these small tweaks, guys. And it was funny. Like I give the British credit. They were listening to like. They would go to these marksmanship, competition shooters and say, what do you guys really look for in sights, iron sights for your rifle? And they said, we want these good, in the diopter with the pinpoint accuracy. It's like, cool, let's go with that. And made for more accurate rifles. And the soldiers are like, dude, I can't use these. I don't have time to sit here and fiddle with my sights for 30 minutes trying to get the right range, So they'd go back and forth and, simplicity versus accuracy. It was just, it gets complicated, guys. And the 1903 is no different. There are many 1903 models, okay? For example, we're going to go with the most common submodel of the 1903, and some call it a different rifle. I'm going to consider it a submodel because at its heart, it is a 1903, right? That's what it is, okay? But it became the standard rifle later on. The 1903 was phased out itself and replaced wholly with the 03A3, right? And this one had different sights in the rear, especially. They moved them and changed what type of sights they were. It had different stamped follower in the magazine, a different shaped stock. Notably, the pistol grip was different. Changes to production to make it easier to produce. Things like it's still the same gun in reality. It's just like an advancement. It's just an advancement in a firearm. And then you had the 1903A4, which was the sniper variant, came with a decent scope for the time, telescopic sight. There are many other submodels. Actually, there's a lot more than I thought they were back in the day, but nothing is a big enough change that it deserves annotation because we're talking about service rifles, and your most common service rifles with the 1903 was the original bare bones 03 and then the 03A3. Especially by World War II, the 03A3 and the A4 as a sniper variant were really, really common, right? So the 03 is a fantastic rifle, guys. If you have one that's busted up or the barrel's damaged or the stock's ruined and you're like, man, this thing doesn't have any value anymore because of what it is, guys, the 03 actually is a pretty good receiver, and you'd be surprised what you could do with it. You could make a custom rifle like me and waste, a couple years of your life on a project that is overrated. So don't actually do that, guys. Seriously, don't do it. Finding a stock alone that's going to be an accurate stock that you can keep bedded and free floated is going to be a much bigger pain than you realize. And I will one day make a video on my 1903 project rifle. I want to make some more progress with it. Got some feeding issues, but huge waste of time in my opinion. Do something different. You can put it back in original configuration for about the same price as building a custom rifle out of it. So just be warned. But I do like the 1903 receiver, guys. Or the rifle in general is great. I like the 03 A3s a little more. I like their sights. Okay, I like this, different pistol grip. And it's in 30-06. God's rifle caliber, right? God's rifle caliber is 30-06, and it's a good rifle. It really is. I think, America hit the nail on the head stealing from the Mauser. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. We stole from the Mauser, and the Mauser 98 is a fantastic service rifle. I mean, that thing was really good for the time. And when I say Mauser 98, I could be speaking about the Gewehr 98, or all the way up to the K98K. I don't really care about the slight differences. The receiver at its soul is the same among all of them, and it's the most copied action in history. The Mauser 98, no matter what someone tells you, if someone says, oh, well, that's just semantics. No, the Mauser 98 is the most copied and derived from action for bolt actions on the entire planet. I mean, that thing, it got it right. And we've been copying it, and now we've been improving on it and modifying it ever since then. But man, it hit the nail on the head. So it was just smart for us to go with the 1903 and base it off of the Mauser 98. Honestly, we could have just done the Mauser 98. Just being honest. Like, for real. Guys, I mean, look at the safety on a 1903. It's also very, very similar to a Mauser. They're almost the same gun. Almost. They're not the same, but they're almost the exact same gun. And I think we could have just avoided some controversy, gone with the Mauser and kept it. But you know how Americans are. We like to just get all American made things, and I understand it. So we're going to go to the next one. So even though the 1903 was the official standard issue rifle of World War I, the U.S. actually fielded drastically more M1917 Infield rifles during the war. The 1917 Infield was an American modification of the British pattern 1914 Infield. And the American modification was named the United States Rifle Caliber 30 model of 1917. And what happened was America needed more rifles for its military, but it didn't make sense to have a few production facilities retool from producing Infields that they were already producing for the British to the new 1903, right? So they would have had to retool all their machines, maybe get new machines. I mean, it would have been a big production change to switch from producing the Infields to the 1903, right? So since they needed them, and they needed them quickly, they just decided to just use the Infield alongside the 1903. They just produced them both at the same time, used them both, okay? But they did, however, retool. They did retool to make this rifle, chambered in 30-06 as opposed to the British 303 Brit cartridge. The 303 Brit it's a decent cartridge. It was a slightly outdated by the time. I think it was a little outdated by World War II. It may not have been outdated entirely by World War I. I think 30-06 is a superior cartridge to the 303 Brit, especially since the 303 Brit is a rimmed cartridge. I still like 303 Brit. It's just that 30-06 is a little more practical, all things considered. So they retooled just to change the chambering to 30-06, which is a lot cheaper and faster to actually do than retooling the whole production facility to make a whole new rifle, which has almost nothing in common. Almost. I say almost. There are things in common, but it's almost nothing in common with the Infield. So the 1917, though, it actually was completely fine doing 30-06 because the receiver is built like a tank and could stand up to the higher pressures. Because 30-06 has higher pressures than the 303 Brit. But not that much was changed to the 1917 to field it in in U.S. military use. Mostly just things directly related to the new 30-06 cartridge, such as the bolt face being different, stripper clip feeding surfaces, the magazine, the chamber, and the rifling. And these are all, this sounds like a long list, but it's actually really not hard to change the rifling. You just switch your tooling to change the rifling, whether it's the twist rate you want or how many grooves you want. And then, stripper clip feeds, easy, just change quickly the dimensions you're machining a stripper clip feeding surface, the magazine's really easy, guys. You're just changing the follower, and then the length, if you need to, of the magazine. Honestly, you could, if it's too big, you can block it even easier. Bolt face is also really easy. You just changing the dimensions, and I believe since it's a rimmed 303 is a rimmed cartridge, it was even easier to do that because you're just machining even less material, right? If that's the case, I have to look back at the 1917 Infield to see how its bolt face actually works. I don't believe it's a recess. Could be wrong though. I need to look at that. So don't take my word on that. But either way, a lot easier to do that than to produce a whole new rifle and completely change your machinery. But it was estimated, and this is an estimation. I'm not saying it's 100% accurate, so don't take it to the bank. But it was estimated that about 75% of rifles used by the United States, what do they call them, expeditionary forces during World War I in France were using 1917 Infields. Okay, 75% of the rifles used by those forces were 1917 Infields, right? So that's a huge difference than how many 1903s were in the World War I. Which is kind of funny because, the U.S., a lot of people think back and they think, okay, the standard issue rifle of Americans in World War I, was a 1903. When it's just like, yes, on paper, but in actuality, in service, the 1917 completely outnumbered the 1903, which is fine because the 1917 is actually a really, really nice rifle. I have 2 receivers for 1917. I'm trying to figure out if I want to build like an original style 1917. It won't be numbers matching, but it might be a cool little project to make a original configuration 1917. Be really fun. But after the war, the majority of these rifles were put into storage. Only some of them were being used by a couple small units in the U.S. military. I believe some, very few mortar crews were using them. But by World War II, the 1903 and its submodels were in high enough numbers to be used as an actual standard issue rifle, which is funny because we didn't have enough to use it as a full-on 100% service rifle in World War I. And by the time we get to World War II, where we have plenty of them, and we have the new 03A3s and the 03A4s, it actually wasn't a service rifle by itself. Okay? Technically, on paper, it wasn't the only standard issue service rifle. If not, it may not have even been considered a standard issue service rifle by World War II because of the next rifle we're going to go over, which is first of all, guys, just back up a second. I want you to think about this. We're about to talk about the rifle that had nothing else like it or anything before it, the M1 Garand. Think about this, right? So I do think it's kind of funny the 03A3 never got its chance to be a full-on service rifle where the entire military was using only it. Because by the time you get to World War II, man, we fielded the crap out of M1 Garands. The M1 Garand, or in military nomenclature, the U.S. rifle caliber 30 M1 would completely overtake the 1903 A3 as the standard issue service rifle for Second World War. Okay? The M1 Garand's development, it started in the 20s, and it was fully adopted and then put into service by 1936. So technically, in not World War time, the 03 was a standard issue service rifle up until 36. But in 36, man, the new rifle, the new hot stuff was the Garand, okay? I'm getting chills just talking about it. And we all know its creator was the famous John C. Garand, or Garand. I don't know how supposedly it's pronounced like errand, like I need to go run some errands. So Garand, or I don't know why Garand just rolls off the tongue better. Maybe it's my arrogant American attitude wanting to say it incorrectly, but it was a French Canadian. John C. Garand was a French Canadian born American firearms designer. He was born in French Canada, and then his dad immigrated to America, and he was raised here. So he was only a child when he was, brought into America, and he grew up here and became a weapons designer. That's a very short version of his life. He did many other things, but he's known most for the M1 Garand. And the M1 Garand originally, it went through a few prototypes. Okay, I'll be honest. There were some prototypes. It had the original one had a really complicated gas trap system, which for those of you who don't understand, think about I can't even compare it to a piston. Let's just ignore. I can't fully describe without having an image or a cutaway or something visual to show you guys how a gas trap system works, but it's actually pretty complicated, and they went away from that anyways. They changed it to a simpler drilled gas port, just a simple drilled gas port, not only for simplicity, but for also reliability, ease of production, right? And this gas directs an operating rod, which moved rearward and engaged with a rotating bolt, okay? So I am not going to give credit to any other firearms that may have had an influence on this rifle because it's the M1 freaking Garand, and it's amazing. It deserves all the glory by itself, okay? If you want to know what influenced it, go look it up on your own. I don't care. I like the Garand. Everyone should like the Garand because at the time, in World War II, this was the bee's knees, dude. Unless you like SMGs, if you like submachine guns, the Thompson and the Grease gun are super cool too, but it's not today's topic. We're talking standard issue service rifles, okay? And you got a really reliable gas piston, semi-automatic, 8-round capacity, 30-06 rifle. Another of God's rifle caliber, 30-06, okay? Guys, this is huge. This was big for the war. Now, this thing's heavy as crap, right? The M1 Garand was a very heavy rifle, but it was just, you can say ahead of the curve because, I mean, other countries had semi-auto rifles, but they weren't fielded to the extent that America's was. A lot of them weren't as reliable. It's just that this was the semi-automatic rifle. I know that, in World War II, Russia played around with the SVT 38 and the SVT 40 before the SKS was ever made. And these were interesting designs. I actually really would like to get my hands on an SVT 40 one day. I don't know if I'll ever have enough money, but interesting system, just not as reliable. Russia really fielded a lot of Mosins and a lot of the PPSH and PPS submachine guns especially by the end of the war. And then Germany had their MP38s and MP40s, their K98Ks. They had the STG-44, but that was late in the war. And then they had the Gewehr. Well, we'll get to that one. We'll get to the Gewehr. But anyways, back to the M1 Garand. Back to the focus, right? 30-06, 8-round capacity, loaded by en-bloc clip. And for those of you who may not know what an en-bloc clip is or what the difference between a clip and a magazine is, there's a real difference, and this is it. A clip leaves the cartridge exposed and often only retains a portion of the cartridge, such as the en-bloc clip, which holds the cartridges in the rear half of the casing. Magazines are enclosed and almost always have their own contained spring and follower, right? So a magazine is what you would put into your semi-automatic striker-fired handgun, your AR-15, your AK-47, right? These things take magazines. The M1 Garand and a couple other firearms of the 1900s, early 1900s, used a clip which had the cartridges exposed. It held onto a portion of them, and the whole thing was inserted into the firearm, including the clip itself. And in the M1 Garand's case, when you were finished firing, it would ding, ding, it would shoot it out, right? That was probably horrible for you guys. But it would ting it out, and it sounds great, and it's just classic. And I love it so much. But anyways, I don't know. Guys, if you haven't actually listened to the ting from an ejected clip of the M1 Garand, or if you've never shot it yourself, you have to. It's a life experience. You need to get it done, okay? Go do it. Go rent one if you can, or find a friend. If you don't have friends, go to the range more often. Be a nice guy. Lend people water, extra ammo. Do your thing. Maybe you'll get to shoot one day. But this rifle, the M1 Garand, was loved by most soldiers who had the pleasure of being issued a legendary piece of hardware. Okay? Its reliability surpassed what I was mentioning earlier, because I got ahead of myself. It surpassed the German Gewehr 43, which was another semi-automatic rifle of the time, but nowhere near as widely produced and fielded. The Gewehr 43 is also an interesting system. However, it is severely overgassed, and if you're shooting, modern loads out of it, you will break and crack the receiver due to the gas. But don't worry, if you got one, you can buy a gas kit that will reduce the gas and make it shooting capable for modern times. But the M1 Garand was a standard issue rifle of the U.S. military until 1958, guys. 1958. That's respectable, right? I think that's a pretty respectable service life, because that puts it in World War II and the Korean War as well, which is interesting. People forget that it was in the Korean War. But honestly, people forget about the Korean War in general. It's like they skip from World War II to Vietnam. And not to mention any conflicts that may or may not have happened in between, but not going to talk about those. But to this day, to this day, the M1 Garand is loved. It's sought after. It continually and consistently rises in average price. There are always extremes, guys. There are really bad ones, and there are amazing ones. So keep your eye out. If you find one that's affordable, there's probably a reason why it's affordable. Be smart if you're looking at buying them. But man, these things are just classics, okay? I think everyone should at least shoot one, if not get to own one day. If you have access to the CMP, through any programs you may be a part of, or through any clubs you may be a part of, you should look into being able to buy an M1 Garand from the CMP. I know they trickle M1 Garands, M1 carbines, sometimes 1903s. I've seen Crags come from the CMP. The 1911s that Trump had released came through the CMP. If you can find a way into the CMP with a connection, you need to do it, because you can get access to things at actually a really affordable rate, and in a trustworthy source. So just look into that, guys. CMP, Civilian Marksmanship Program. Check it out. It's not easy to get in, and you're not getting in with them. You're getting in with somebody else who is in with them. Okay, it's kind of complicated. They don't make it easy on you, but definitely check it out. One thing to note is if you do own and shoot your own M1 Garand, seldomly or on a regular basis, you need to look into shooting lower pressure ammunition if you can. Especially, I really think you shouldn't shoot it with modern high pressure 30-06. And I'm not saying every modern round that's loaded in 2020. I mean a round that's got higher pressures than the pressures. The P's in this mic. I had to move the pop filter. You want to stay beneath or at the M2 ball surplus ammunition pressures of the time. And you can find the information on M2 ball, 30-06 M2 ball. Look into that and try to, if you're going to shoot the M1 Garand, try to shoot ammunition that's either at that pressure or lower if you can, okay? M1 Garands have been known to be damaged by new modern high pressure 30-06 cartridges, okay? Be safe, guys. That's really important. The next rifle is the only one we're going to go over, or the last one we're going to go over for this episode. We will go over more in the next episode. We'll make it a 2-part series. This is part 1. So are you guys ready to hear the next U.S. military service rifle? All right, so the next one is the M14, and it existed. All right, so next time we're going to start at the M16, and we're going to work our way up to the modern rifles, guys. I really hope you enjoyed. Hope to see you guys next time. Find us on Instagram at TBR Gunworks. Same thing with Facebook and our website, tbrgunworks.com. Guys, leave a review on the podcast sites if you don't mind. Don't forget to like, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share the YouTube video if you are into it. Sorry this was a little drier, but this is informational stuff, guys. This is for you collectors out there, or you people who are just interested in the history and the small minutia, not the deep minutia. That's a different channel. But hope you guys enjoy. Please be safe. Don't forget, every firearms law is an infringement. Take care.